This week, Governor J.B. Pritzker says there are limits on the Second Amendment. Next week, he is going to have to defend that argument in federal court as the combined consolidated cases in the Southern District have a hearing set for April 12th. The order posted yesterday says that they've got the hearing April 12th, 1:30. That's when it begins in the Southern District Court in East St. Louis. The judge saying in the docket, each party shall identify the number of attorneys and named parties that'll be present. They got to do that by Monday. Any party with audiovisual needs will have to contact their tech people by Friday. You've got the order being signed there. But also in that case, you've got an amicus brief that's been modified by the Second Amendment Law Center. So a lot of debates and arguments are going to be had about what is Illinois' gun and magazine ban and registry. And this obviously is something that's a lot of attention's on. I've been covering this practically every day we've been on the air because there's been twists and turns all around. But yesterday, Governor J.B. Pritzker at an unrelated event in Champaign, he was asked about how he plans to address gun violence. This was more in reference to after the Chicago mayoral election. But the question was how to keep guns out of the hands of young people who want to do harm. Maybe gang violence getting in that conversation as well. But here's the governor reacting to that question of how to combat gun violence, especially in urban areas.
Who have been getting their hands more easily on guns, and that's resulted in violent crime, more crime. And your question is what can we do as a state, as a region, to deal with that, to address that? Is that fair? So let me begin by saying that it's very important for us to recognize that there are certain guns that should not be available to the general public broadly. And you've seen that I believe I showed my own view about that, and the General Assembly showed its view on it when we banned assault weapons in the state of Illinois. That's just a beginning. That doesn't take care of all the weapons that are out there, but let's face it, those weapons are attractive sometimes for people to get a hold of, whether they intend to commit a mass shooting or just to take it with them as what they think is self-protection, but in a violent circumstance, maybe to commit a crime. So we've got to make sure that those are off our streets, and we voted to make sure that that happens in the state of Illinois. Second, look, there is a Second Amendment to the Constitution, but there are limits to what that means. It's, we can all read what we will about what that clause in the Constitution means. But one thing it doesn't mean is that everybody in every circumstance should be able to get a hold of every gun. And so from my perspective, making sure that we have universal background checks, again, something I ran on and won on, and we got that done in the General Assembly, universal background checks. Now, what's going to keep people, young people, who are legally allowed to own a gun from using it in a violent crime? We've got to make sure that we're addressing poverty, that we're getting people jobs, that we're lifting up communities that have been left out and left behind, because it's often those circumstances in which people end up committing a crime because they feel they have no other choices. So we've got to address this issue from multiple perspectives. I want to add one more thing, and I think this showed out in the results in the Chicago election too, that that there was one candidate who made out crime as if it's a single issue, that it has one facet to it, and that is putting more law enforcement on the street. Now, I happen to think that we do need more law enforcement on the street, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you should do. That doesn't solve the problem by itself. You also have to make sure that, again, that we're providing resources for mental health and substance abuse treatment. And many of the young people who are getting a hold of guns are in need of mental health and substance use treatment. And if we can address those issues, we take a huge burden off the police, and I believe, reduce violent crime significantly because we're addressing some of the underlying causes.
Now, some have said, why not make that the priority rather than going after the tool that is, some say, protected by the Second Amendment? But I want to hear from you at 217-629-7970. Your thoughts to the governor saying that there are limits to the Second Amendment. 217-629-7970. We'll get to your phone calls coming up. Also, we'll share with you some of the kind of preview of what the hearing could be like at the federal court in the Southern District April 12th, just 2 days after the next phase of the state's gun and magazine ban kicks in, where criminal penalties could be leveled if you have a certain type of semi-automatic weapon not restrained properly, or certain types of magazines in your possession out in public. So stay tuned. Much more coming up here on WMAY.
Let me begin by saying that it's very important for us to recognize that there are certain guns that should not be available to the general public broadly. And you've seen that I believe I showed my own view about that, and the General Assembly showed its view on it when we banned assault weapons in the state of Illinois. That's just a beginning. That doesn't take care of all the weapons that are out there, but let's face it, those weapons are attractive sometimes for people to get a hold of, whether they intend to commit a mass shooting or just to take it with them as what they think is self-protection, but in a violent circumstance, maybe to commit a crime. So we've got to make sure that those are off our streets, and we've voted to make sure that that happens in the state of Illinois. Second, look, there is a Second Amendment to the Constitution, but there are limits to what that means. It's, we can all read what we will about what that clause in the Constitution means, but one thing it doesn't mean is that everybody in every circumstance should be able to get a hold of every gun.
That's Governor J.B. Pritzker, who yesterday said that the ban on semi-automatic weapons and magazines in a gun registry is, quote, just the beginning. He also says that the Second Amendment has limits. What do you think? 217-629-7970. That's the phone number. I want to hear from you at, again, 217-629-7970. The Second Amendment, I'll speak it to you. It's a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. People see that last clause, shall not be infringed, as a crucial element, and something that is in its wording crystal clear, shall not be infringed. Others pointing out that the Second Amendment isn't a regulation at all on individuals and what kinds of guns they can have. It's a restriction on what government is able to do. So that's what really the Bill of Rights is all about, is it's spelling out the limits on government, not necessarily on individuals. So government can't abridge free speech. Government can't tell you what groups to be a part of. Government can't tell you what religion to be a part of. Government can't restrict the press. Government can't restrict the right to keep and bear arms. Says in the Second Amendment, shall not be infringed. So the governor's saying that the Second Amendment has limitations this week. Next week, he's going to have to defend that in court in the Southern District of Illinois, where you've got combined consolidated cases against Illinois' gun ban. One of the plaintiffs in that case is the Federal Firearms Licensees of Illinois, and I talked again with Todd Vandermeide yesterday to get a bit of a preview on what some of the central arguments are in this case. Here's what Todd had to share as to what to expect heading into court April 12th down in East St. Louis.
Well, you got to go back to the New York test. So the New York test is, does the text of the Second Amendment protect this? And if so, then the burden shifts to the state. And what they are trying to do is a number of things. They are trying to argue that the Second Amendment does not protect these types of firearms, to which we call BS. Because then they said there's no right to sell these things. Again, we call BS, because they should be reading Illinois Firearm Retailers Association, where Chicago tried banning the sale of guns by banning gun shops, and the court said no, there has to be a right to obtain firearms. You have the Izell case from the Seventh Circuit, which talked about the right to acquire as well as the right to maintain proficiency. So you have all those things right in front of them. So the state's on shaky ground with the beginning of their premises from there. Then you move, then they have to find a historical analog to that the regulation they're talking about here is completely within what the founding fathers would have accepted. And we've seen what they've tried to struggle and bootstrap up with Bowie knife laws, which were about carriage, not about ownership and possession, and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think they say that they tried to revive the argument from Friedman, the case in Highland Park that said that, where they said that these weren't in existence in 1791, therefore they're not protected, which is utter nonsense based on what the court wrote in Heller. Said some have made the argument bordering on the frivolous. Only those arms in existence in the 18th century are protected. We do not view constitutional rights that way. And so, no, I mean, they keep making whatever specious arguments that they can. And so we will obviously be pushing against all that, trying to frame the New York test that is now the test of the land and show how that goes on. We're also watching the Maryland case. It could come down any day now. You've got the California cases. They could come down any day now. You have the Atkinson case out of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that could be the first case to set some sort of standard of review in light of that case was heard in November, just months after the New York decision came down, and it is at the Court of Appeals. So there's a lot going on here. There are a lot of moving pieces. You really need a bingo scorecard to kind of keep tabs on everything.
Oh, we've been doing that each and every morning here on WMAY. It was, again, Todd Vandermeide, gun rights advocate, giving a bit of a preview of the arguments that the plaintiffs are set to give against the governor, who said this week that there are limits to the Second Amendment. What are your thoughts? 217-629-7970. Thanks for hanging on. Good morning. You're on the air.
Yeah, good morning, Greg. I think my biggest concern continues to go back to mental illness and the fact that that never gets brought up. And
to the governor's credit, though, yesterday when he talked about this, he said, hey, the assault weapons ban is just the beginning. There are limits to the Second Amendment. But then he shifted gear to talk about focusing on young people, poverty, education, and things along those lines. I don't think he necessarily talked about mental illness, though.
Yeah, but when you look back at mass shootings, the people that are doing these things are, have those issues going on in their lives. You don't see like some guy that goes to work, 9 to 5 every day, just suddenly deciding to pull out an AR-15 and kill everybody. Like, there's things going on beyond that in each of these people's lives. And that's the thing that bugs me. And they're not, most of these shootings, even with the gang-related stuff in Chicago, there's criminals involved with a lot of those numbers that they're sharing. And it's not, again, law-abiding citizens who have a FOID card, who have gone through all these steps and done this stuff. It is people that are circumventing the law, and I don't understand why they're not addressing that first. I have no problem with somebody that has a mental illness, has a criminal record, has these things, like them having to, have limits on some of their rights because we're holding them accountable. Right. But the other things just don't.
Yeah, it seems like they're going after the entirety of law-abiding gun owners without focusing on those who are causing the most harm. I appreciate the call. Got to take another one before the break. Thanks for hanging on. You're on WMAY. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Are you talking to me?
I'm talking to you. You talking to me?
Oh. In reference to the right to keep and bear arms, I had a question. What does the word arms mean? What stops somebody from buying a cannon or a flamethrower or a bazooka? What constitutes arms?
Yeah, and that's not something I'm going to be able to tell you here in 2 minutes, except that it could be a handgun, a rifle, a long gun, a shotgun, those types of things. And people who push back and say you can't have, fully automatic machine guns, you can, actually. You got to go through a certain permitting process, but you can own those. You can own cannons. The country's weapons systems are not developed by the U.S. government. They're developed by private companies that get tax dollars from the U.S. government. So I don't know if that answers your question as far as, the idea of what arms are, what constitutes arms, but that's obviously a question that's being debated in the courts, not just in Illinois, across the country. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Yeah, I have a couple of points, actually. Actually, just two.
Real quick, please.
Yeah. First off, Second Amendment was written right after we overthrew our government that was really impeding on us dramatically. And this was written to make sure that we had the ability to make sure this never, ever happens again.
For the security of a free state, the Second Amendment says. Second point?
Yeah, for foreign and domestic.
Yep.
Second point is most of the issues that we're having are definition issues. When they talk about an assault weapon, they really need to define what an assault weapon is, or weapons of war. I own plenty of guns. Some of what they call are ARs, and none of them are weapons of war.
Yeah, and that definition is, something that's created in the law that passed. It's not something that, you're necessarily going to hear being talked about as assault weapons when you go to a gun store, for instance. That's all the time we've got for this segment. Appreciate everybody. It's now 6:55.
Apply at Culver's West on Wabash.